Hello, everybody. Welcome to the VETS History Workshops webinar. I'm going to be chairing the session. My name is Dukelo Nshapo. Today we have Annie Devenish, who's a historian and a researcher with an interest in gender and activism, identity in the global South, and how practices of history can be harnessed to transform society. She has published on feminism and development in India and South Africa, labor activism and the informal economy, as well as traditional health practitioners. Her book titled Debating Women's Participation in India in 1930 to 1960 explores the agency of Indian feminists and nationalists whose career straddled their transition from colonial to independent India. It addresses some of the critical aspects of the encounters, engagements, and dialogue between the Indian state and its women citizens, in particular, how this generation conceptualized the relationship between citizenship, equality, and gender justice. She is currently based at Wits University as a lecturer in the history department. I'm going to give her 20 to 25 minutes. As soon as she's ready, she's going to be also using slides. And then after that, we'll take hands for questions and comments. Over to you, Annie.
Thanks so much, Tukelo, and thanks to everyone for coming today and for giving me the opportunity and the platform to explore South Asian diasporic connections and Afro-Asian solidarities in the life of South African anti-apartheid activist Phyllis Naidoo. I'd like to start by providing a bit of background on this paper, which is in fact a draft version of a chapter that I'm writing for an edited book called South Asia Unbound: Spaces and Scales of Internationalism. This project brings together interdisciplinary group of scholars to explore South Asia's historic international entanglements, contextualizing the region's global importance in the 21st century, and in the process disrupting the sort of international relations as primarily a field for the Euro-American world. So South Asia Unbound investigates states, institutions, networks, communities, and individuals as agents of South Asian global engagement, moving between the local, regional, national, and supranational levels, and spanning the time from before and after the subcontinent's political independence. In the case of my chapter on Phyllis Naidoo, she is obviously geographically outside the boundaries of South Asia, but through her family history and her activism, she is deeply entangled both in Southern Africa and South Asia, in this particular context, India specifically. Furthermore, her transnational networks, travels, and solidarities, and through her practice of a particular kind of emotional diplomacy, which I talk about more in the written paper if you've had a chance to read it, but I don't have time to go into it in detail in this sort of presentation. I feel that she is an agent of South Asian global engagement, and it's sort of on this basis that I'm contributing to this book project. Okay, you can change to slide number 2. Great. Okay, so this then gives me, this opens up a space for thinking about how Phyllis Naidoo, as a woman at the intersection of two Indian Ocean worlds and of two freedom struggles, navigated her activism between and beyond these worlds, and of course, practiced her particular brand of transnationalism. Taking a further step backwards from this, then this particular paper or chapter on Asian diasporic connections and Afro-Asian solidarities is in turn part of the larger project I'm working on independently, which aims to put together an edited collected volume of the correspondence of Phyllis Naidoo, drawing on the rich collection of letters, papers, documents, photo albums, personal objects and other memorabilia that she donated to the Gandhi Latuli Documentation Center, which is based at the University of KwaZulu-Natal Westville campus. And in addition to using this collection to reflect on transnational connections and questions of identity, which is the focus of this presentation today, in my broader project, I also want to explore themes such as, and here you can change to slide number 3, the making of struggle archives and the position of such archives in post-apartheid South Africa, the meaning of home in exile. You can go back to the previous slide. Yep, great. The meaning of home in exile and how activists recreate home in such spaces, and the role of friendships and a politics of intimacy in liberation movement histories. So I hope this provides some broader context. Now to get back to the focus of my presentation for today. As I've already mentioned, as a third-generation South African of Indian origins and as a member of a community with a history of a resistance and anti-colonial protest going back to Gandhi's 1913 Satyagraha and beyond, the story of Phyllis Naidoo, as I stressed earlier, is a story of deep entanglement with South Africa and a rooted commitment to a place and its people. As the grandchild of indentured workers and as a member of an Indian diasporic community on the east coast of Southern Africa, it's equally the story of migration and networks, speaking to the complex dynamic and multi-layered identities of diasporic Indians, as identified by Sana Iyer, Margaret Friends, Avtar Bra, and others. So the life and the activism of Phyllis Naidoo therefore provides an entry point for exploring how the meaning of being African and the nature of Indian diasporic identity intersect and are both being continually negotiated across the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st. Now, when I first started to interview comrades, friends, and family of Phyllis, asking them about how Phyllis Naidoo saw and understood her own Indian heritage and identity, the response that repeatedly came back was that Phyllis would have shouted down a question like that. She saw herself as being African and South African first and foremost. In other words, she would have rejected the very premise of this question itself. And this was interesting and kind of complicated the way I began to think about identity. Certainly, although Phyllis might have rejected in an interview or being asked questions about Indian heritage or identity, if you look at Phyllis's life and her activism and how this is embedded in larger networks of identity and struggle, there are many Indian resonances. So I realized there wasn't going to be a straightforward answer to this question, that this would be a study full of tensions and contradictions in terms of how Phyllis saw and renegotiated her identity throughout her life. And the more I researched, I began to see a pattern develop. Phyllis's diasporic identity is certainly dynamic, at times intersecting with the anti-apartheid struggle that she is committed to and providing scope for reflection on herself as an activist and a human being, while at other times it sits in tension with her commitment to an inclusive South African identity and hence is rejected outright or absorbed within a broader understanding of Africanness. And I came to see that Phyllis's life and activism reflects these tensions or these shifts almost within an arc. Her political awakening occurs within an interracial transnationalist space, fostering an anti-colonial political imaginary shaped by a strong connection with India in the 40s and 50s. The development of her political thinking, influenced by the traditions of non-racialism, however, means that as she matures, these diasporic connections come to be seen as divisive and are rejected in solidarity with an expanded notion of being African, as the daughter of its soil, and through the shared expression of oppression and resistance. Later on in her life, the experience of exile and the process of returning home to South Africa encourages Phyllis to equally return home to her diasporic roots, but this time in a more personal capacity by reflecting on her family history, the experience of her grandparents as migrants in relation to her own experience of exile, and how this forms part of a legacy for her grandchildren. Now, what I want to do with the rest of the time I have available is to trace the shift or this arc by drawing on two images that I found in her collection in the Gandhi Luthuli Documentation Center archives. And the first of these is the one that you can see up on the screen now. This image shows the first group of passive resistance protesters campaigning against the Asiatic Land Tenure Representation Act of 1946. This piece of discriminatory legislation restricted the franchise of Indians through educational and property qualifications and enforced segregation by legislating separate residential areas for Indians. When the act came into force in June 1946, the Natal Indian Congress launched a civil disobedience campaign, which saw a total of 1,750 Indians jailed in protest. While Phyllis was too young to be directly involved in this campaign, some of her student friends at the NGO, the charity she was working for at the time, which was the Friends of the Sick Association, that nursed people recovering from tuberculosis. So some of her student friends were involved and went to jail for the cause. And witnessing these acts of resistance had a significant impact on her, as she explained. They were breaking laws and going in. That's where it started. You see, it's very hard to live in a society like this and watch from the road as you're going to work, people being arrested for being without a pass, or watch people being kicked into vans. And it was this then sort of growing awareness that led her to join the non-European unity movement in 1950, and which brought her into contact with debates and study groups where she learned the mechanics of politics. So this really was the beginning of her political awakening. Now, underneath this photograph is a quotation from Indian nationalist leader and the first Prime Minister of independent India, Jawaharlal Nehru, which says, "The day is coming when the strong arm and the stout heart of India will protect her children wherever they may be." And you can also see that Phyllis has annotated this image. Underneath Nehru's quote, there is what is possibly a retrospective handwritten comment, which says, "not come to pass." And certainly as a young adult, Phyllis would probably have had little idea that she would spend the next half of a century fighting a system which represented everything her values and principles stood against. And you may be able to see it's quite small, but there's also an annotated arrow pointing to one of the individuals in this group in the photograph. And this is her future second husband and South African Communist Party stalwart, MD Naidoo. So this image was a wonderful find for a historian and has these great personal touches and annotations on it as well. Okay, now this image and the quotation beneath it obviously speak directly to this transnationalist space that I was talking about earlier, which helps to foster an anti-colonial political imaginary shaped by a strong connection with India in the 1940s and the 1950s. And we see this in South Africa, we see it back in India as well, and also in Kenya. And this transnationalist space and imaginary has been documented by the work of Sana Iyer and Margaret Friends, looking at the Indian diaspora and their involvement in anti-colonial politics in Kenya, and in South Africa by the work of Ariana Lusoni, who argues as well that a parallel development took place amongst African and Indian political movements in South Africa during the 40s and the 50s, with the rise of a new generation of progressive leaders, including Monty Naika and Yusuf Dadoo. And Lusoni has written extensively a great chapter as well on Yusuf Dadoo and how he sort of embodies a kind of transnational Indian identity, which has been very useful for my own research. So two intersecting dynamics therefore shape this sort of political imaginary into which Phyllis awakens as a young adult activist in the 40s and 50s. The first dynamic was this political connection with India and the drawing of inspiration from its people, its tradition and its traditions of resistance, and of course its newfound nation status, because after a long struggle, India gains independence from Britain in 1947. And this struggle is documented and very much at the forefront of kind of activism and political movements in South Africa at the time. And then secondly, the sort of second dynamic is that there's this growing Afro-Asian solidarity defined by closer collaboration between Indian, colored and Black communities in a joint struggle against racial discrimination and a demand for universal suffrage. And this is also shaped by a shared sense of belonging and being part of a shared oppressed community. Now, while India remained an ally throughout the period of the liberation struggle in South Africa and an outspoken critic of apartheid, the oppressive nature of state-imposed racial categories used to divide and rule, and the strong traditions of non-racialism that were prominent in the political organizations that Phyllis was a member of, left little scope for thinking of the identity politics of Indianness. And this ultimately leads Phyllis, like that of many other South Africans of Indian origin, to identify with and position themselves as African rather than Indian. So after this initial period of kind of connection between South Africa and India, in the sort of arc that I'm talking about, there's sort of a movement away from this. Now, this, of course, leads me onto a discussion of non-racialism, which I go into in more detail in the written paper that was circulated, and which really becomes a sort of foundation block for Phyllis's own political activism. And I talk about the sort of different understandings of non-racialism, and I also talk in my written paper about the way in which Phyllis lived various forms of Afro-Asian solidarity. But as I've already said, this sort of emphasis on non-racialism, which is an attempt to reject the racial categories created by colonialism and by apartheid, leaves some room for a cultural identity of Indianness, but little room for the identity politics of Indianness, where ethnic and racial identities come to be seen as divisive and as a tool of the oppressor. And this sort of then, I use this to then kind of explain Phyllis's rejection of the question of kind of Indian heritage or Indian diasporic identity. It perhaps helps to explain why Phyllis would have rejected being asked this question in the first place and would have claimed herself as South African. But then after Phyllis's return from exile, following this arc, which starts with a close connection between South Africa and India and then a moving away, we see a return or a reclaiming of her diasporic roots. And I argue this, in fact, begins during her time in exile. And to talk about this return, I want to show you the next image in the collection, and you can turn to the next slide. That's great, thanks. So one of the items found in Phyllis's collection of memorabilia is this photograph showing a group of indentured Indians disembarking at the harbour of Port Natal. The image is dated, so this is when the image was printed in the newspaper, July 29th, 2000, which of course marks the 140th anniversary of the arrival of the first indentured Indians in the colony of Natal. And you can see that above the image, Phyllis has written, "My proud roots." And this image then comes from the twilight period of her life following her return from exile. And it's one of a number of laminated photographs and newspaper clippings that are discovered in an uncatalogued box in her archive collection. And these were memorabilia that had been stuck up on her wall in her flat in Umbilo. So how can we explain this turning of the arc again? Well, at this time, when Phyllis returns from exile, she's in her early 60s, and the focus of the liberation movement has shifted towards negotiating and envisioning a new society. So there was now, for the first time, occasion for reflection. People her age began to look at who they were, her friend Omar Badsha tells us. And she started to relate then her experience to that of her grandchildren. Furthermore, as the post-apartheid nation state took shape, a new space opened up for acknowledgement and celebration of South Africa's diverse cultural heritage within the Rainbow Nation. While the apartheid state had exploited diversity to separate and dominate, as Vahid and Desai emphasize, the new ANC government provided space for South Africans to recreate themselves within particular cultural, racial, and ethnic milieus. So, and this is also the period in Phyllis's life where she really begins to write a lot. She produces her Footprints in Grey Street and her, which is one of a kind of broader series of footprints books. And she writes a lot about others and ordinary people and foot soldiers in the liberation struggle. And along with writing then, Phyllis would reminisce about her granny. Now, while her grandmother would have been an old lady when Phyllis was growing up, in reminiscing, Phyllis remembered her as a young girl. Her grandmother would have told stories, possibly over and over again, which she would have listened to, about a young woman getting married and coming to a strange country. And when Phyllis started to write, these memories become prominent. Also reading a book about the history of Christian Indians in South Africa, and her father's family had been Christian Indians who'd come over. She learned more about the paternal side of the family, and this then spurred her to do further research. So as a result, the issue of India becomes one of many interests that defined her in the post-apartheid period. Now, as I've said, it's on returning from exile that Phyllis starts to have the time and the space to begin reflecting on her roots. But the origins of this reflection, I believe, extend further back to her time in exile. Although living in the apartheid state in South Africa was in some senses a place of oppression, it was literal and ideological home in other respects for Phyllis. Her family was deeply rooted here, and she knew no other homeland. And it was not only birth that then made South Africa home for Phyllis. But Phyllis also had equally found an identity for herself in South Africa through an inclusive sense of Blackness and Africanness, which encompassed all those who were oppressed. And as an activist, she was part of a non-racial political movement that sought to bring all peoples together as South Africans. Furthermore, the all-consuming nature of political allegiance and identity as an anti-apartheid activist left little room for alternative imaginings or understandings of self. This sense of identity, however, was severely disrupted when she fled into exile. And while she was able to find belonging once again as part of a community of exiles, it did lead to, I believe, a reorientation of herself in the world and an opening up of a space for her to begin thinking of other identities, including those of her diasporic roots. Right, so I've now traced this arc, and I'm just going to conclude quickly in a minute or two. So Vahid and Desai remind us that if one gazes over the 20th century, one is struck by the way in which Indian identity has been constructed, deconstructed, and remade. Across this time, Indians have been variously coolies, British subjects, colonial borns, aliens, Indians, non-whites, Black, and all the way back to Indian South African. Throughout Phyllis's own life, the meaning of being an African with the Indian diasporic roots has been equally dynamic, illustrative of the contextual nature of identity and belonging, which is not fixed essence at all, lying unchanged outside history and culture. From the time of her political awakening in the late 1940s, when within a space of transnational imagining, where diasporic connections were a source of inspiration and pride, through to her identification as part of a Black oppressed majority, and her activism within a movement grounded on non-racialism, which left little room for ethnic or racial identity politics. Then returning again to her experience of exile, which disrupted the sense of belonging, opening up a space for the resurfacing of buried diasporic connections and belonging, and right through to her return and the making of post-apartheid South Africa, with its emphasis on diversity, coinciding with a time of renewed reflection and writing of self within broader struggle histories. Across this time, there is a movement towards, then away from, then back towards these Indian diasporic roots, but one that is always firmly situated within a broader sense of South Africanness. And I think this movement is very interesting because it really opens up space to begin debating the complex nature of identity in post-apartheid South Africa, and also African identity, but with linkages into networks and diasporic roots. And I'll conclude here.
All right, thank you so much, Annie, for your presentation. And thank you for keeping to time. At this point, we're going to take 3 comments and questions. I already see John's hand is up. You can also use the chat facility, and I can sort of read the question. I don't see any other hand at this time. So maybe John, go for it, and then we'll come back.
Hi, thanks, Doc, for that interesting presentation. So I'm currently involved in quite a lot of political work, so I'm very keen to have seen this discussion, particularly of the context of diasporic identity. And so I read your paper. I've got basically 3 questions for you. The first is just, you can hear me, right? Okay, cool. The first is in your paper. I noticed you said Tamil Naidu. Is it not Tamil Nadu?
I'm sure it is. It's probably a typo or an oversight on my part. Thank you.
No worries. Second question, just a small technical one that I don't understand. I heard you use the word imaginary as a noun. What exactly do you mean by that?
A noun rather than a verb.
What adjective?
Or adjective. I think by a noun, I'm referring to the idea of a space.
Okay.
Yeah, so a kind of a space into which, obviously, a conceptual space, which is broader than just the notion of a nation state based on race. Yeah, but the idea of belonging to a kind of shared community, I suppose, that it would encompass colonial and former colonial subjects. You know, in this case, there's a strong connection between India and South and East Africa, but could also encompass other sort of subjects in the global South.
Cool, thanks. Is that like a technical term in history, or is it your?
It's a term that I've come across through the work of Sana Iyer and Margaret Friends and some of the other scholars who've been working on Indians in Kenya. Okay, cool.
Last question, and this is the one that might cause a discussion. So we're talking about how towards the end of her life, she sort of reverts to a South Indian identity and talks about her proud roots. And one thinks about, for example, her membership of the Communist Party and how the Communist Party is really an internationalist movement. So if you look at the old propaganda posters, they always have Mir, you know, for the world. And they always talk about the world worker movement. So I wonder if she just sort of abandoned Africanness, or she decided to go sort of back to her roots like that. And one thinks of, say, the tensions, you know, in this country in terms of, you know, who's African, where you'll find some, you know, the people who benefited from colonialism might say, you know, I'm African because I was born here, or because they feel an affinity or a patriotism. And I wonder if you could talk a bit on that and how she sort of reconciled that, or how one reconciles that, generally speaking. Because you said, you know, you talk about non-racialism as an attempt to reject, your quote was, attempt to reject the racial categories created by colonialism and apartheid, right? Now Indian is one of those categories, right? So if you're going to reject those categories, then there becomes a question of, you know, for example, restitution or land ownership. Like you want to say, well, this person can't own land because they're not really African. So all these sort of controversial things come up when you want to try and go back to your roots and identify yourself as a particular racial group, which is what you want to reject if you're a communist. I don't know if that question's clear enough.
I'm not sure. I think let me mull over it, and I think they wanted to take some other questions,
sure,
and
no
perhaps
worries.
I can come back for clarification.
Cool, no problem. Thanks for your time.
All right, cool. While you think about that, Maya and Uma has their hand up. Please go ahead. Go ahead, Maya.
Really interesting. And yeah, sorry, I think maybe my internet is a bit delayed. So I'm going to try. I'll put them in the chat. First, thanks, Annie, for a really great talk. And I think for me, I haven't read it in full, but I'm finding a lot of intersections between my own examinations of Indian or South Asian and Black solidarities in spaces of diaspora, including South Africa originally. So the first, I have two questions, if that's okay, and they both have to do particularly with themes that you bring up of identity. So the first one is that I'm curious about how the terminology or ideology of solidarity specifically come up with relation to Phyllis Naidoo's work in your examination of it, because I was curious if, for example, when speaking of Afro-Asian solidarities, if that would be about solidarities between South Africans and Indian activists in India, or if Phyllis might have seen herself to be an Indian South African organizing in solidarity with Black South Africans, or if instead, through a non-racialist lens, that would have been a shared struggle instead. I hope that's clear. I'll put it in the chat as well. And then the second question was, I was curious if it's okay to ask this, and you're comfortable responding, how your own experience, perhaps, and national identity and diaspora in your own life has intersected with your exploration of Phyllis Naidoo's politics in life, if at all. Because I think for myself, as someone who's a diasporic, involved in solidarity work, a lot of the work that I've been doing is navigating how my own identity shows up also South Africa, where I'm based. So yeah, I was really curious about that. I hope you could hear me. Sorry about the internet struggles. And thank you.
Yes, we could hear you. And thanks for those interesting questions, Maya.
All right, Uma, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you. I haven't read the paper, so I'm just basing my comments on the presentation. I just wanted to make a point about that newspaper clipping that you have. It's actually July 2000, I think you said. So that is when my book From Cane Fields to Freedom was released. And the newspapers were just full of photographs from that book. So I'm really pleased that Phyllis found it important to cut out that particular thing and label it in that particular way. I think we're also lucky that Phyllis is not around to be here at your seminar, because she was a very, very outspoken person. And I've heard her at South African Historical Society, where she shredded the presenter. She had really strong views on everything. But my real comment is really one of the most exciting essays that I've ever read on Phyllis Naidoo is actually Antoinette Burton's essay on it, in which she looks at the writings of Phyllis Naidoo, and in particular the publications on Grey Street area, which in many ways, takes Grey Street not as an Indian place, and it is in the reading of the way she puts together. It's a Phyllis Naidoo as a historian, and through that work as a historian, one can get quite a good idea of Phyllis Naidoo's identity. And so I was wondering whether, I think that would probably be more important than probably that photograph. So I just wondered if you had any comments on that.
Right. Cool. Maybe I should read this from John. I think it's a follow-up. So he says, so I guess what I mean is, how did she or how did any others reconcile the tension between Africanness or identifying with Africa vis-a-vis internationalism of, say, the SACP, or again, the one's roots? These things seem to contradict. Sure. Yeah, you can answer, and then we'll take more questions.
Great. Well, thanks everyone. I'm going to start with Uma, because I think kind of a response has popped into my head straight away, and to say, I obviously have also looked at your book From Cane Fields to Freedom, and really enjoyed it, particularly the visual aspect. And I'm so pleased that you brought up Antoinette Burton's chapter on Phyllis Naidoo, which I think is called Hands and Feet Grey Street, right, which is a fantastic read and really interesting. And I hadn't thought about thinking of Phyllis as a historian, and I think, and obviously she had to be a historian to do the research for her writing, and that I think that's going to be kind of a useful conceptual turning for me. So just also to mention that that picture of the indentured workers embarking at sort of Durban Harbour was one of a number of images that were found sort of bundled together. And actually one of those images includes the dust cover of her book, Footprints in Grey Street. So it's all these various images sort of bundled together kind of tell the story of these sort of transnational linkages or connections. So yes, I guess I haven't really answered a question, but sort of just spoken to your comments. And then Maya as well, thank you so much for your questions and input. And the first was around terminology. Again, a really useful question for me, which I don't think I've thought about in enough detail. And in some senses, I realize now, as you're asking this, that what I'm doing in some ways is I'm imposing a particular Phyllis didn't use the term Afro-Asian solidarity herself to describe her activism or her work. It is in some respects a term which I am kind of using to interpret her work. And I think in this case, it speaks more, it isn't so much specifically about a South African Indian connection, but I think it's a broader, it's a term that I'm using to try and understand the way in which Phyllis's life and activism as a South African with diasporic roots is connected with and embedded in other struggles, if that makes sense. Your other question about how my own diasporic experience might have shaped my research. I'm sadly, I wish I had Indian roots. I don't. My family and my family heritage is mainly German and European settlers who came out to South Africa a number of generations ago. Although South Africans being a mixed bunch, I'm sure somewhere along the line there must be some Indian connections. But I can't, growing up, I've sort of grown up in a culture as a kind of white English-speaking South African. So I don't have those direct kind of diasporic Indian connections. I suppose I have other kinds of diasporic connections that link me back to Britain and Scotland and other places where my ancestors came from. And then finally, John's question as well. And I must say, these questions have all been really insightful and have got me thinking, which is about how do you reconcile Africanness versus this sort of internationalism of the South African Communist Party. And that is a very interesting one, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer it on the spot. I might have to think about it. Certainly, Phyllis expresses a strong sense of internationalism in her activism and in her life, mainly I think through her sense of solidarity with the struggles of other people in the global South. Whether I'm not sure that a sense of Africanism has to be inherently opposed to kind of notions of internationalism, but I think I might have to take a bit of time to think more about this question. Okay, thanks.
All right, cool. We still have a bit of time to take more questions and comments. I don't see any hands, so maybe I should go to the chat. So Peter says, about Exile Days in 1989, it was my set role to deliver to Phyllis in Harare a letter from Jack and Ray Simmons in Lusaka about the assassination of her son. In her garden, the Zim army had stationed a soldier in those tension times. A prestigious correspondent, she kept AAM activists brought up to date on a range of viral matters by letter and phone. I guess that's a comment.
Who's that from again?
From Peter. Oh yeah, and then he follows up and says, I just looked inside her Leronare Batu booklet and found a letter from Phyllis mentioning she had just RETD'd from Zim and was en route to Transkei about her Chris Honey book, which she wanted to finish by 30th, 1992, had forgotten this. Yeah, I guess those are comments. I don't see any more hands. Maybe you could sort of do your concluding remarks, and then if you've had time to sort of think about the other missing questions that you said you're gonna think about. Yeah.
So you want me to kind of maybe
because
more.
yeah.
Well, I mean, one of the things I think that comes through in the paper, but I haven't really had time to include in the presentation, is to talk a bit more about Phyllis's particular sort of brand of sort of internationalism, which I think comes through in the paper in terms of her networking and her connections. And it's quite an interesting way in which to connect the sort of official politics of struggle histories with the personal. And it also relates quite nicely to kind of Peter Lim's comment that Phyllis certainly used personal connections and friendships to facilitate her activism. And this is reflected in turn in the sort of vast number of letters she wrote to friends and comrades all over the world. And I guess there hasn't been much time for discussing this in the presentation, but I sort of bringing it up now just to reflect on how her sort of collection of letters and her life can show us another facet of struggle histories. But I wonder if there might be any final comments or questions from the audience.
Yeah, we still have a few more minutes to take more questions. I was hoping that while you do that, I'll get more hands.
I see there is another comment from Ariana in the chat, which is interesting about.
Okay.
Should
I read it, or
will you? Please do.
Okay, let me read it. So she says, "Hi Annie, have you thought about her places in exile, Lesotho and Zim, in relation to the argument about identity you are trying to make?" All right.
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting because she finds herself in exile in other countries in Southern Africa. And of course, during the early parts of her exile as well, after she's injured in a parcel bomb, she goes to visit Angola as well. And certainly, I think that this experience of living in other sort of countries in Southern Africa, and these are you know, obviously their context is different to South Africa, on the one hand allows her to, certainly in the case of Lesotho, to develop a kind of a particular critique against certain notions of capitalist development. Her visit to Angola is very important for her because as a communist and a socialist, she is sort of seeing socialism in practice, an alternative vision of the society. And I think perhaps, and then Zimbabwe as well. So what I didn't mention is in the collection of objects where we find this photograph showing Indian indentured workers embarking from the newspaper, I've also mentioned there are other images, including a dust jacket of her book Footprints in Grey Street. And along with that, one of the other images we find is an image of one of the stone eagles from Great Zimbabwe. And I sort of put these images together to kind of show her sort of her embeddedness in Southern Africa and her transnational kind of connections. But I think this must have given her a deeper sense of being part of a community that within Southern Africa, and kind of claiming a sense of belonging to this community.
All right, thank you for that. And I think you've partly touched on Pamila's question in the chat. She says, great presentation and paper. Can you say more about the personal objects in the collection for Naidoo and what they say about her her identity making? So I'll take I'll take the last round. I'll take Njogu, and then I'll take Omar. Those are the only hands I see now. Yeah, and that'll be the last round. Go ahead, Njogu, and then Omar will follow.
Yeah, thanks, Annie. It's a very interesting paper, and really learned a lot, and the exchanges have been quite interesting. My question really follows up, I think, in some senses, from Ariana's question. I mean, I find your paper and your talk very geographical. You're speaking often about all these kind of different spaces in which she's moving through and getting involved in. It's already there, and I think implicit in your paper, but I'm wondering, what did you do for your analysis to bring the different spaces that she's in terms of the cultures, the politics that exist in those different spaces that she's moving in, and in thinking about the making of her identity, how she sees herself as a result of immersion in this different spaces. But as I said, it's kind of implicit, but it's just really if there's any value in bringing that to the foreground. Yeah, again, interesting paper. Thanks.
Omar, you can go ahead. If you could unmute, please. You're muted, Omar.
Sorry, I grew up with Phyllis and also worked with her very closely in the underground, and then when she comes back from exile, or while she was in exile also. And so I have a very intimate knowledge about this issue of identity and the debates that begin to emerge. And then we have to be careful, because I think the issue of who is an African was not just an issue raised by this minority group or people from this minority group. It also is very evident in the discourse among people in exile and in prison, and when people begin to talk about themselves, their lives in very confined spaces, and they begin to understand this very complex issue of identity. With Phyllis, when she comes back from exile, there is a dialogue between a number of people around the issue of who we are, how do we become an African nation or a free African nation, or how do we integrate people? And this dialogue is between herself, myself, Governor Mbeki, and one or two others. And it's also a dialogue about how does one begin to rewrite history, because that's what was happening at that stage when they come back from exile and when we all meet and begin thinking about this new society. And then the divisions that emerged, and very sharp divisions that becomes not only racial but tribal, with the contestation, especially in Natal, between Inkatha and the Congress movement, Inkatha and the Indian community, and things like that. All of these things, feeds into her need to capture history, to write about history, and also to celebrate the lives of people. Because again, she was writing for a younger audience. So all I want to say is that the issue of identity shifts over time for all South African, oppressed South Africans. And the need, at times, it is seen as part of, if you're part of the Congress movement or the Communist Party, each one of these are things that people go through, and it's a complex issue. And in Phyllis's case, she comes back and struggles with her life, her own life, and tries to find a way of expressing herself and expressing her South Africanism. And so, yeah, so she begins to write, like a number of other people coming back, or people from inside wanting to write about their experiences and to deal with the notion of South Africanism. I just wanted to say that, thank you. I've been sitting around with a number of people that, not only Phyllis, but even up to now with other veterans, and how they begin to relate or create an identity which is South African, but at the same time Zulu or Xhosa or Indian and things. And there's all of these things throw up lots of issues, and we have to be very cautious in how we deal with the minority communities and the issue of identity. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Omar.
Thank you so much for the questions and the comments. So Annie, I think you can sort of answer all the questions and then perhaps do your concluding remarks, because I do not see any other hands. Thanks.
Yes, so I think it was Njongu's question around what happens if we take all these different places that Phyllis kind of lived in or was connected to, and we try and look at them not sort of separately or individually, but collectively, which I think is a great question. And in some senses, it's something I've been trying to do, but I'm perhaps not there yet. But one of the ways in which I certainly think that having a sense of kind of global solidarity and being able to make the connections between different kinds of struggle and experiences of oppression is one of the ways in which Phyllis tried to kind of transcend a specific place and also fixed identity in some respects. I think looking at the notion of networks is also another way to kind of escape geographical place, or to think of the connections between different places rather than sort of one specific place. So that's the one question. I think, and Omar, thank you so much for your thoughts and your input. And I've been taking notes. And I think what you've said is again very helpful for me. Yes, certainly we need to think that it wasn't just kind of the Indian community that was grappling with the notion of identity in post-apartheid South Africa, but sort of all peoples who had been oppressed, and the changing context and new tensions were forcing them to kind of rethink and reconsider identity. And I don't know if there have been other questions in the chat. I think that was it, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Okay.
And yeah. Thank you so much, Annie, for your presentation and for sharing your paper. And thank you to everyone who participated. This session was recorded, and it will be available on the History Workshop YouTube page. And I guess that brings us to the end of today's seminar, webinar. Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Bye.